Hi everyone, and welcome to the Field Processing Methods for Fingerprint Evidence lecture. Let's get started. In the previous lecture video, you learned about the basic fingerprint evidence collection process. In this video, I want to discuss more specifically the procedures involved in physical processing methods for latent fingerprints at a crime scene. There is no one-size-fits-all processing method. Different surfaces and substances require different processing approaches. As your textbook discusses, it's also common to use multiple processing techniques on a single piece of evidence in order to obtain the highest quality and quantity of latent fingerprints possible. Again, with multiple processing techniques, though, you need to keep in mind the destructiveness of the method itself. Make sure to process in sequential order that represents the best developmental sequence possible. Now, oftentimes investigators become accustomed to collecting fingerprints off of basic surfaces like tables, door frames, doorknobs, handles, that type of thing. Because the investigator is familiar with these surfaces, they already may know what type of processing method will work. However, investigators will also encounter new surfaces that they may not be sure about. Sometimes it's helpful to test the processing method on the surface while at the scene to ensure that the fingerprint collection will go smoothly. To test out a surface, use the processing method on the surface itself, but process as far away from the evidence as possible in order to eliminate contamination. The image here on this slide shows you an example of why testing a processing method on a surface is so important. There are actually two different processing methods shown here. On the left, you can see a black silk powder was used to try and obtain a latent fingerprint. Notice that you can see the outline of the finger somewhat, but the powder is also adhering to the wood grain, and so there's no usable fingerprint that's visualized. Now compare that to the latent fingerprint obtained from the process on the right, which used magnetic powder instead. Here the powder only had minimal interaction with the wood surface, and a high-quality fingerprint was able to be visualized. Now there are three main categories of physical processing: regular powders, magnetic powders, and fluorescent powders. And I want to go over each in turn over the next few slides. Regular fingerprint powder is a fine granular powder that adheres to the water or fat contained within the fingerprint. Regular fingerprint powders are typically applied with a fiberglass or animal hair brush. To process a fingerprint with regular powder, a very small amount of powder is deposited onto a folded piece of paper. The brush is then dipped into the fold so that the brush hairs grab onto the powder granules. It's extremely easy to overpowder a brush, meaning that there's too much powder. So make sure you only use a tiny amount of powder at a time. And don't forget, if the brush is used, it already has powder on it. You should also twirl the brush between your fingers on top of the folded paper in order to get rid of the excess powder. Once the brush is powdered and ready to go, you're going to twirl the brush over the area that are believed to contain fingerprints. You want to hold the brush so that only the tip of the brush is actually hitting the surface. So when you twirl it, you just want that little bit at the end to actually touch the surface. That's going to avoid damaging the fingerprint. You also want to avoid over-processing the fingerprint by removing the brush as soon as you visualize the fingerprint ridges. This usually only requires 1 or 2 swipes across the surface. If you go over and over and over and over and over the ridge details too much, you're going to deposit too much of the powder over the print, and you end up losing the ridge detail. Especially in today's world with touch DNA capabilities, you need to be very careful about contamination concerns. Studies have shown that trace evidence can be transferred from one scene to another through a fingerprint brush. Dipping the fingerprint brush into a folded piece of paper is one way to reduce contamination. After the scene is done, you throw away the paper with any remaining powder. That way, you are not putting powder that's mixed with your brush back into your primary fingerprint powder container. Some agencies are even moving towards single-use brushes to further reduce contamination. Now in this course, we don't have the luxury of single-use brushes, but please do take steps to avoid contaminating the main container of fingerprint powder as much as possible. One last thing is to only use one brush per powder type and powder color. Regular powder comes both in white and black, as well as specialized colors as needed. Now I have labeled all of the fingerprint brush tubes for this course with the corresponding powder color. Please make sure only to use the matching fingerprint brush with the matching fingerprint powder. Regular black fingerprint powder gets everywhere. up your nose, on your clothes, in the air, everywhere. Wow, I didn't mean to rhyme that much, but I did. So for that reason, many investigators prefer to use magnetic powder. This powder consists of tiny granules like regular powder, but the granules are either magnetic flakes themselves or the powder contains magnetic materials that carry the powder. The magnetism of magnetic powder allows the fingerprint powder to adhere more strongly to the fingerprint brush, called a magnetic wand, and that reduces the amount of powder that is scattered about the scene. Magnetic powder also allows for more easy cleanup of the scene because the investigator can clean the wand of powder and then wave the empty wand over the surface in order to gather up any remaining powder. Now, to dust for fingerprints using magnetic powder, you're going to use the same folded paper technique I described for regular paper. Most wands are designed so they have a movable magnetic stem in the wand, and you'll know what I mean when you get to play with this in the lab. The magnetic stem typically rests in the on position, with the magnetic stem located inside the wand tip. When you pull the tip up, the magnetic stem is removed from the bottom of the wand, and the powder falls off the end of the wand because now it's not magnetic. Since the resting position is on, all you have to do to use the wand is dip it into the powder pile, and it's going to collect a large clump of magnetic powder. Move the wand in a circular motion over the surface you're trying to process. Again, just like the previous, don't let the wand touch the surface directly because that can damage the fingerprint. The only thing that should be in physical contact with the surface is the clump of magnetic powder itself. So you want to get a big clump on it so that it can just trail over the fingerprint. Now, once you have visualized the latent fingerprints on a surface, you're going to drop off the extra powder back into your folded paper simply by moving the wand to your paper and then pulling up to remove the magnetic stem. You can then go back and wand the surface again with the empty brush because that's going to collect that excess powder that you dropped during your initial lift. Again, be careful not to put the tip of the wand against the surface itself, but just hold it just right above the surface so that it attracts the loose powder. Now, magnetic powder is by nature magnetic, and that means you have to be aware of what type of surface you're going to use it on. Using magnetic powder on a magnetic surface is going to coat the entire surface with powder, and you're going to lose all of your fingerprint detail. Magnetic powder can also be more challenging on vertical surfaces because of the potential loss of powder. Try holding those wands vertically, and it gets very challenging. And you're not going to make your homeowner very happy if their entire floor is covered with drop powder from your analysis. Now, the thing that magnetic wands have a large advantage of over regular powder is the wand cleanup. Not only can you clean up the surface easily enough, you can also clean the wand. This allows you to use the same wand for different scenes and different powder colors, so long as you thoroughly clean it before each change. The last type of physical powders that are used to collect fingerprints is fluorescent powders. These come in regular and magnetic varieties, and they're applied the same way as their non-fluorescent counterpart. The advantage of fluorescent powders is that they're going to fluoresce under certain lighting conditions. This makes these powders especially helpful powder when you get into a situation where the background makes the print difficult to visualize. For example, if you have fingerprints on a patterned piece of evidence, like I want to say clothing, but if you have a surface that has a big pattern on it, that can be really difficult to document the fingerprint, particularly if the background pattern contains either black or white detail, because it's going to start mixing in with the print. By using fluorescent powder and ALS photography, the background can be essentially deleted, or at least substantially reduced, and then the print is more easily able to be visualized and documented. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that when fluorescent images are captured, they have to be adjusted before they're submitted to the Automated Fingerprint Identification System, or AFIS. AFIS is designed to read black lines as the ridges and white spaces as the valleys between. But in fluorescent powders, the black lines are the valleys and the colored areas are the ridges. So fluorescent powder fingerprints must be color corrected to be a black and white so that blacks are the ridges and whites are the valleys to ensure that the computer will read the fingerprint correctly when it's loaded into AFIS. This same procedure is necessary when you process a fingerprint with white powder as well as instead of black powder as well. But typically, we're not going to do that as often as we're going to use fluorescent powders. Now here are some examples of fingerprint powders. You can see that the type of powder is determined based on the background characteristics of the surface. While the black powder works great on the light surface on the top left, gray or white powder works better when the background is dark as well, like the top right. Fluorescent powders allow for the visualization of the fingerprint very clearly, even though the background is textured and potentially distracting in color. Here's a flowchart from Baxter's Complete Crime Scene Investigation Handbook that I think you may find useful. This flowchart takes into account the characteristics of the surface and the latent print deposition, and then recommends a chronological procedure for lifting fingerprints from the evidence. Baxter's book actually has several more flowcharts that are very specific to porous surfaces, bloody surfaces, painted surfaces, all kinds of different surfaces, and gives you a flowchart. And this is what fingerprint examiners will be very comfortable using to determine the chronological flow of processing for latent fingerprints. Just some final cautions about physical processing methods. Never use powder on wet surfaces. Instead, you have two options. First, there are special reagents that are designed specifically to work on wet surfaces. Otherwise, if you don't have one of those, air dry the evidence and wait to process for fingerprints until the evidence is fully dried. This is going to ensure that you do not contaminate the powder or damage the latent print. And also, although I've already mentioned this, I do want to reiterate that you should never reuse powder that's been used on surfaces that are obviously contaminated. This is particularly important when you're working with surfaces containing dried blood or biological fluids. Remember, we want to treat all biological fluids as if they are contaminated because viruses can live in dried samples for periods of time. If you are fingerprinting something and it contains a dry fluid, it's recommended to completely dispose of the brush after using it to avoid contaminating other evidence or exposing yourself to infectious material. Regardless of what specific development method you use, the next step is to document the fingerprint and preserve it as evidence. To document, photograph the latent fingerprint on the surface itself, then collect the fingerprint if possible. Most collection methods use a tape lift, which I'll discuss on the following slide. Once you have lifted the print, photograph the lifted print and then document the location of your tape lift using a sketch. Most fingerprint cards, including ours, contain a place for you to draw a rough sketch of the item and to document the location of the fingerprint lift. Remember that all photographs should be examination quality photographs, which means they should be composed accordingly. They need to fill the frame with the fingerprint, the camera needs to be directly perpendicular to the frame, and you need to have a measurement of some sort. In addition, in order to fill the frame with the fingerprint, oftentimes a macro lens is recommended. And I have specific 35mm lenses that are best for this if you're taking fingerprint photos. Now, as I mentioned, tape lifting is the most common way to collect and preserve a latent fingerprint. Tape lifting uses clear tape that is smoothed over the processed print and then lifted from the surface and placed onto a solid fingerprint card. Lifting tape comes in a variety of sizes and thicknesses to ensure that you can capture latent prints from a variety of surfaces. In order to ensure a quality lift that can be used for latent fingerprint comparison, make sure there are no wrinkles or folds in your tape. I recommend putting tape down on one edge of the print and then slowly smoothing it across the entire latent print. This will help ensure that the whole tape is flat. To pick the tape up, remove slowly in the same manner, starting from one end and slowly pulling up until the entire tape is lifted. Once you've lifted the print, you're going to repeat that exact same process of putting the edge on, smoothing the tape down onto the fingerprint card. You should choose a fingerprint card backing that contrasts with your powder, meaning that fingerprints that are processed with black powder should be preserved on a white background, and fingerprints processed with white powder should be preserved on a black background. That provides the easiest visualization for later analysis. All of your tape lifts should be documented like the evidence packages, meaning that they require information like the case number, the date and location of the crime scene, the investigator's identification, etc. Fingerprints cards should also identify the processing method that was used to lift the fingerprint and the specific location of that latent print on the object in question. The location should be documented using a rough sketch on the fingerprint card, if possible. Now, sometimes a surface is not conducive to lifting with plain clear tape. In these cases, there are other lifting techniques that are used to preserve prints. One of these is called diff lift tape. It looks like tape, but it's a lot thicker. Diff lift tape can be used to collect fingerprints from textured surfaces like siding, steering wheels, and other rough surfaces. The investigator will apply the diff lift tape in the same manner as clear tape, but the thickness of the tape allows the investigator to press the tape down, and it'll go into those small, deep areas where the normal tape would miss. Another alternative lifting technique uses a clear casting agent like forensic sil, microsil, or even clear glue. The casting agent is applied directly over the fingerprint and left to air dry. The cast will adhere to the processed print, and it will lift the residue from the surface when removed. Once dry, the cast is removed from the surface and it's preserved just like any other piece of physical evidence. One final thing I want to discuss are some of the chemical processing techniques that you will practice in this course. Like I said previously, most chemical processing methods will be completed in the crime lab, but there are some chemical processing techniques that are more commonly used in the field as well, and I want to discuss those a little bit more in depth here. These include sticky side powder and cyanoacrylate. Let's start with sticky side powder, otherwise known as wet wop. This processing method is used to process latent fingerprints on sticky surfaces, like the sticky side of duct tape. Sticky side powder contains powder that's suspended in a liquid solution. The powder is painted onto the sticky side of the surface, and it's left to sit for 1 or 2 minutes to allow the fingerprints to develop. The surface is then rinsed with water to remove the solution, and it leaves behind the processed prints. If the fingerprints are light or still very difficult to visualize, the sticky side powder process can be repeated an additional time to enhance the fingerprint visibility. Here are a few fingerprints that have been processed with wet wop. You can see the process on the left, first the painting of the surface with the powder and the rinsing of the solution. The images on the right are fingerprints that were visualized using wet wop on actual duct tape. Now the last processing method I want to talk about is cyanoacrylate fuming, which is also known as superglue fuming. Superglue fuming is used to produce prints on non-porous surfaces. Unlike other processing methods, superglue fuming creates a permanent set of white ridges that can be further enhanced with regular or fluorescent powders. Because superglue fuming is permanent, the white ridges can't be lifted with tape, although future processing can be lifted accordingly. Now, superglue fuming works by heating superglue in a sealed chamber with a humidity of 80%. This is achieved by placing a glass of water into the sealed chamber, so there's a continual source of water vapor during the processing. When gaseous, the superglue will attach onto the fingerprint and create permanent polymer growth on the latent print. Like other processing methods, it's important to avoid over-processing the fingerprint in order to reduce ridge loss. To help investigators identify when the fingerprints are processed, a test print is placed inside the chamber with the evidence items. The investigator should watch the test print over the course of the fuming and finish the fuming when the test print shows clear ridges. While cyanoacrylate can be a very helpful processing method, particularly for surfaces that are difficult to print with traditional powders, it does present some challenges for investigators. Cyanoacrylate fuming can interfere with future analyses, including question document analysis, hair and fiber analysis, and firearm testing. Investigators should be careful to document on the package if a piece of evidence has been subjected to cyanoacrylate analysis. Here are some images of the different ways to complete cyanoacrylate fuming. The chamber itself can range from a specially designed fuming chamber to a homemade chamber out of a fish tank or just PVC pipes. There's also a special superglue wand that's available commercially that doesn't require a sealed chamber at all, but instead will deposit the superglue vapors directly onto the surface. And so all you need to do is a vent hood to eliminate the vapors. All right, well, that's it for this lecture. Thanks for watching, everyone.